Good morning, I'm Brother Frank, and this is our session of Rooted. And I've been assigned the task of talking about the judges of Israel. Now, you might have thought that Judges was only a book in the Bible, but that's not true. Before Israel had kings, they had judges, men that were put in place to not only make decisions, but also to render proper leadership and judgment. You know some of the judges. There were basically about 12 major judges, one of which was Samson and Gideon and Deborah, and you know some of those. And if I got to telling you some of the stories of the others, you would begin to know them as well. So Israel had 12 judges that helped them in the way of leadership and ruling. And that idea of a judge was one that would have the heart and mind of God and rule among the people well. Most of the time when Israel got in trouble with being disobedient with God, they would find themselves in a place of turmoil and chaos, and God would bring to them someone who would be that judge for them, that leader that would lead them out of the dilemma that they had found themselves in. It was certainly each time a rebellion against the authority and the leadership of God. And so judges were a very necessary part of the early formation of the nation of Israel, especially them becoming God's people. It would be through these judges that God would speak to his people about who he wanted them to be and the examples of who God could use. Now, not all the judges were exemplary in all the things that they did. We know the story of Samson and his lack of behavior, but we also know that all men are sinful, every one of us. And that doesn't hinder God from using us. It may hinder him from using us to the fullness that he would like to use us, but God can use any vessel that will place itself in his hands. And that's a good lesson for us to remember today. By definition, the word judge means to rule or command with justice. And so God was looking for people who would rule and command with justice, setting aside their own feelings, their own attitudes, their own personal preferences. And for us today, as we stand as God's ambassadors in a lost and dying world, we too must recognize there has to be something greater than our own desires that motivates us to be what God would intend to use us to be. Every time Israel repented, God would raise up a judge to lead them, to restore them, to take them where he needed, because they were his people. Today, you and I, if we're born again, if we're Christians, we're God's people. And each time that we go astray, God will raise up someone, something, a set of circumstances to help us through the Holy Spirit. And that will be our judge, will guide us to the right direction. But just like Israel had to follow the leadership of those judges, we have to follow that leadership of the Holy Spirit as well. And so it's through the example of the judges that we see God leading us, and we become subject to the Holy Spirit as he guides us. Every time a judge died, Israel would go astray. Before Israel could have kings, judges is what God used. Friends, today, when we allow the guiding forces in our lives to die, our Bible studies, our prayer time, our church attendance, fellowship with other believers, every time we allow those things to die in our lives, we're going to go astray. And God needs to raise them back up in our lives. Many of you, just like me, can bear testimony of that in your own life. When I lost my way, it was because I strayed away from that which God had put in my life to keep me going. The judges are going to be an integral part of the history of Israel and of our lives as well, and certainly of the Christian faith. I hope you'll join us the next few weeks as we take a look at some of these judges and how their role played an integral part to completing God's will.